Hi there! Today we are looking at the top 5 mistakes that watercolourists can make when they're starting out. You and I have been painting together for a good few months now, so I thought this was the perfect time to address some of those issues that you might be having. We all go through this, by the way. Even I found all these things when I was starting out. So get your kit, because we're going to actually have a little practice of all these little things that we need to improve on, and let's get started. So the first mistake that we make in watercolour is not choosing the right supplies. Now, I have always stated that you should buy the best materials that you can afford, so I'm not going to start slagging off the student range or the aquafine versions of Daler Rowney, for example, because that's what I sell in my kits and it's a really fantastic starter paint. However, I should always try and get the best possible, but it's not so much about the materials themselves, it's about how you look after them. So let's go through it. So for a start, the paint, the best thing about the paints is they last a long time, and that is very much down to the better quality you get, the longer it will last. So I have mine all in a palette, and the great thing about this palette is I can close it, and that keeps the dust out of the palette, because you always end up getting little bits of fluff and things in your paint. So with the paint, you want to try and get the best quality you can afford, and also with your palette, just try and keep it as clean as possible to refrain from getting any kind of dust in your colour. The next mistake that can be made is with brushes. Again, I love these Masterstroke Pro Art brushes that are actually really very affordable. Again, I like to champion affordable watercolour kit. You can get some really beautiful smart brushes, but it's all about looking after them. Now, I've managed to find a brush that's a little bit on its last legs. It's a bit tufty, and instead of being like a beautiful fine point. Now, a lot of brushes when they're dry will look like this, and it's only after wetting them in the water that if they struggle to make a fine point, then that's time to say goodbye. This one's not bad. You can also help it along by sort of twizzling it in your palette and things. That's not a bad fine point at all, so that's pretty good. But as soon as you're unable to get a nice fine point, it's time to say goodbye to the brush. But one of the big mistakes that people make with their brushes, and if I bring in the water just for a second, is by doing that, leaving your brushes in the water. It's such a no-no, because it's not only the fact that the bristles will become bent and damaged, it's also that the paint will flake off the actual handle of the brush. And I'm lucky that I was going to say, do I have an example? I don't have an example, because my brushes don't tend to ever be left in water unless I'm in a really absent-minded moment. So look after your brushes, and even the cheaper, more affordable ones will last a long time. Now, one thing that you really can't scrimp on is the paper. I always use a 300-gram cold pressed textured paper, and I like to use the best quality I can find. So my favourite is the Langton Prestige cold pressed paper, which is made with cotton pulp, which is lovely. Now, I've found a really other end of the market sort of kind of card paper that's, it's barely watercolour paper. It's also smooth. It's more of a hot press thing. But we're going to do a little experiment between these two and just see what I mean, because I think to demonstrate this is the best thing. So let's get some blue, some cobalt blue. And the paper, the difference between qualities of paper really shows when you start to use lots of water. So that's not bad, but it's just kind of swiping over the top of the paper, and it's not really seeping in, it's not really doing much. It's a very sort of skimmy kind of affair. but it's more about what happens once it starts to seep in. So let's put that to one side. And we'll paint the same on here. Actually, let's put it to one side so we can actually see the two of them. So this is soaking in the colour really nicely. We're getting a sort of smoothish blend, even though I'm doing a zigzag. Beautiful, feathery, even blends. And that is what you want from watercolour paper. You want it to be able to hold and soak in the colour and manage lots and lots of water. Now if you compare with this, it's just sort of, well, for a start it's really bowing, if you can see from the side there. The curve is really coming, and what also happens is it will start to warp and wiggle like a sort of strange wave, but also you get these weird kind of uneven blends. It sits up on the page as well, you can see the puddling there, whereas with our other watercolour paper we've got a much smoother blend. It's sinking in, the paper is holding on to that colour, and it's just doing a way better job, and it's going to dry much more in a controlled manner and not warp and do all funny things. So the big mistake I think when it comes to materials is scrimping on the paper. I think as long as you look after your brushes and look after your paints really well, you'll be fine, but paper is where you really shouldn't scrimp. The second mistake is your water and knowing when it's time to change it. Now a lot of people choose to have two glasses of water, and they have one that they keep clean and the other can be for cleaning off the paint from the previous brush, and then you just dip it in the clean water. I actually prefer to use a single glass of water just because I've self-taught and I've never really gotten into the habit of using it. However, there comes a point where it starts to look like swamp water, when it's opaque essentially. So what we're going to look at is if I get the two extremes, the clear water and the solid water, and we're just going to look at using a clean brush and how you've got a lovely clean line there, and we could drop in some nice colour. Let's drop in a bit of yellow. Oh, gorgeous. It blends down really beautifully. Now, if I clean that brush off entirely, and then say for example I was midway through painting and I just was not that keen on getting up and changing my water, I couldn't be bothered. So instead I got in there, got my clean, well, tried to get my brush as clean as possible, and I just wanted to put some nice clear water down to be able to put my yellow. Oh my goodness, that is disgusting, because not only is it blue water, but there was like pigment residue in the bottom. So that's me trying to use clean, in inverted commas, water. So we already know, well, firstly, that if that brush then dips into there, it's going to start to contaminate the yellow there before it's even gone on. So I'm, for the sake of you guys, because I love you, I'm going to do it. Ugh, just about get away with that. And then, oh dear, dull, nasty, and not the colour that we were hoping for at all. So make sure you keep your water fresh. The next mistake is thinking that you have any kind of control over the water and the colour. And what I mean by that is the best watercolour results come from when you just allow the water and the colour to do its thing, and you're the best supporting act really when it comes to watercolour. You're helping it along, but it wants to be free. So I am demonstrating this by just wetting the page with a clean brush, and I'm going to choose a nice bright red, cadmium red, waking that up there, and I'm just going to paint a circle of red. Oh, lovely. And oh no, I've got a blob. That's not what I wanted. Or is it? See, now people who see that as a problem, as a mistake. Kind of need to loosen up. Watercolour, and when there's lots of water and when you are getting a big blend, it's going to do what it wants, and we can control a few variables. We control the amount of water we put on, which I'm going to come to in the next one. But on the whole, the way watercolour blends of its own accord is so much more interesting and beautiful than the human hand could possibly get to. So I'm just going to demonstrate for you. If I do this one more time, so get my clean brush again, and just make that wet patch on the page, and I say, right, I want to do a red circle, and then I want to do a blue circle next to it, and I want them to be perfect circles. So I'm going to paint my red circle. I've got my blob. This is me in character, by the way, saying I've got my blob. It's not a role play. And then I'm going to take my blue, and I want 2 perfect circles. And I start to panic. And I go, oh no, and I clean my brush. And I'm like, well, what if I tried and just like tried to poke that? Oh God, no. Oh, what if I tried to? And what happens is you end up with a red and blue sludgy mess that goes flat and dull and lifeless because I tried to mess about with it too much. Whereas if I celebrate the fact that watercolour does its own thing, we'll all be much happier. So one last demonstration here. But I should just accept that watercolour does what it wants, but also if I just let it do what it wants, it will come up with something so beautiful that I would not be able to effectively manage that myself. So that mistake we make is trying to play God too much, trying to control the watercolour. Just let it do its thing. This next mistake is also on the subject of water, so I thought we would just keep that one in our thoughts. So I'll leave that one there, and I'm going to use the corner of the bottom one here. It's really important to try and use up all the corners of your watercolour paper when you're just playing about like this. That's just a little aside. So water, hey? Water's a funny one. A lot of people say to me, I just don't know how to get the right amount of water on the page on my brush. So the mistake we make is not getting the right amount of water. So you're either using too much, which we call puddling. So that is getting so much sort of standing water on the page. You can see I'm just scooping it off and creating a little lake on here, which is just so unwieldy for the colour. The colour will hit the water and it won't even get near the paper because the water is just a swimming pool sat on top of the page. Here we go, a little bit more. Right, there we go. And let's just try popping in a bit of colour. And say I wanted to paint that same red circle that I tried, and I know I've said it's all about sort of allowing the watercolour to do its thing, but imagine if you couldn't even get anywhere near the page. That is too much water, if you hadn't already worked out for yourself. So I always recommend, if you just sort of tilt your head to the side, hopefully we'll be able to see from the side angle here that there is just so much water going on there. It is impossible. And if I even give it a shake, and look, it's not even touching the water, not even touching the page, I beg your pardon. So too much water is when it's standing water on the page, and it's just going to take forever to soak in. If you had, some people like to use a sort of heat tool, to like a sort of purpose done hair dryer to dry their pages a bit quicker. That would just send the water shooting across the page like this. There's me coming in with my face. So that's a big no-no. However, the polar opposite, if I get my brush really bone dry here, okay, really blot it off. Now I'm gonna just pick up a tiny bit of that red. It's so hard to, even though I've got a bit of a watery colour in there, I'm just trying to get some on the bristles. And this brush was wet and we did try and dry it, but there's still going to be a little bit of moisture. And just look, the polar opposite. Not what we want. So let's have a look at these two here. Too much water. We've now got, even the wonderful watercolour paper is struggling under the amount of so much water we've got here. And here it's barely made it around before sputtering out and drying off the brush. So we've got our two extremes, but how do we manage to get the happy medium in between? Well, it's all about going with caution. You can add, but it's harder to take away. So I always like to start off my sessions with a brush that is nicely wetted, but also that I've just kind of blotted off the wetness of the bristles on the side. I also make sure that I've woken up my colour in the palette before I put it on the page. So it's not just about sort of adding water and going straight onto the page. It's about making sure your colour is nicely supple in there for a starter, and then adding it onto the page. That's not bad, but oh look, we've still got a bit of a dry brush effect, but it's not the end of the world, because all we need to do, we don't need any more colour, but what we do need is a little bit more water. And we can just smooth that with a single stroke, and we've suddenly got a lovely smooth circle. So it's all about being able to add in little increments rather than going all in or not nearly enough. I've prepared something to demonstrate this last mistake, which is starting too dark. And what that means is when we are creating a piece with watercolour, we're building up layers, and you will struggle to put a light colour on top of a dark colour that's already gone there, because watercolour is translucent in its nature. It's not thick and opaque like gouache or oils. So I've got two ready painted and dry surfaces here. We've got some cadmium yellow, nice and translucent, and we've got some Prussian blue, which also isn't so thick and strong and concentrated that it's impossible to get anything on top of it, but it is difficult. So let me just show you. Let's try first a nice little doodle on top of the yellow here. So it's nice and dry, so I'm doing my layers. I've got a little bit of water there on the brush. So without too much effort, we've got some nice little leaves coming in. And I'm just doing single layers. I'm working fairly concentrated, but the main thing is it's showing up really nicely on top of the yellow. We're not struggling at all. And the other cool thing is we don't even need to go in with a really dark, strong colour. We've got our cadmium yellow. What if we just added some cadmium orange on top? Even then, it shows up really nicely. So just think through the composition of your pieces before you start them, because if you start too dark, you've got nowhere to go. Whereas we've got all the time in the world to come up with something nice to build up onto the cadmium yellow. But let's have a look on the navy blue here. Now, I could make my paint really thick. And that just about shows up. But if I wanted to do something nice and delicate, then we're going to have trouble, aren't we? And this is how we use watercolour. Even if I make it a little bit thicker, it's still really struggling to show up on top of it. Whereas if we'd built up the colours, built up that blue, started it nice and light, we could have maybe gotten away with something nice and yellow on top. The trouble is if we start to paint that thickly, ugh, it's not really watercolour after that, and you may as well be using gouache, and even then we're still struggling to get a completely solid colour through. And the other thing is we'll use up all of our colour really quickly, and that's just not the nature of watercolour. So if you really enjoy the dark colour with a light colour on top, I can highly recommend painting in gouache, which is a funny sounding word. I've got notes in the episode notes below for links to some resources there, but if you're painting in watercolour, you're going to have a much happier time starting with a light colour and building up your dark colours. But this also applies to pencil. So when I draw in pencil, sometimes it's a bit tricky on film because it's hard to see because it's so pale on the screen. So I'm drawing like a leaf on a branch. I'll sort of draw a nice faint line with some lines coming off the top. And the reason I do my really faint pencil is because it can be quite tricky to rub out pencil once it's been painted over. So I use an HB pencil, just a really standard HB, but this is a 5B pencil, okay? So I'm just going to draw the same line. There we go. And let's just paint the same leaf over the top, nice and translucent, and see how we get on. Could drop in a little bit of colour, make it look a bit pretty. Lovely and translucent, lovely and delicate. And this is the thing, I mean, some people like painting in a really bold kind of manner, but that's just not really what watercolour is for. So I think if you're thinking, oh yeah, I quite like the bold approach, then like I said, gouache is your friend. See, already the pencil, it's there, but it's not too bold, is it? We can quite happily ignore it, and if we really wanted, we could rub it out afterwards because the paint is not thick. It's fairly translucent. Whereas here, the first problem we're going to have is when I paint very translucently over the top of this, I find that the paint actually reacts and doesn't really want to go down on the page. I mean, we're barely seeing it, are we? And then, problem. We can see it very strong. So the only way to cover over it is to paint in a much more concentrated manner. And even then, we can still see it. And then our problem after that is that we can't rub it out because a very thick paint is much harder to rub out. Now again, this is a sort of stylized way of illustration, I suppose, that some people might really love. So as opposed to being a mistake, sometimes mistakes lead to fun discoveries, and I have that ethos front and center when I am painting, because I think, especially as a self-taught person, some of the best paintings I've created have come from making mistakes, basically. So you can see here we've got a strong pencil. We can still see it even after painting really dark over the top, whereas up here we've got a nice sort of translucent leaf shape. Let's fill in some of those, make it a bit nicer. And we can barely see the pencil anyway, but if we did want to rub it out, we'd stand a much better chance. So that should help iron out the creases in your watercolour painting. I just find it's good to look after your kit and take it slow and enjoy it. That's the most important thing. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you again next time. Bye!